You've always been such a burden on this family. My mother's voice echoed through the bank lobby, sharp enough to cut through the hushed professional atmosphere. The bank manager's face went pale as she glanced down at the file in her hands, then back up at my parents with an expression of utter disbelief. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, but are you aware that your daughter Maya has been paying your mortgage for the past 7 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant clicking of keyboards from teller stations across the marble floor. My father's face drained of color as though someone had physically extracted the blood from his veins. My mother's mouth opened and closed twice without producing a single sound, her eyes darting between me and the bank manager as though surely someone would step forward and correct this obvious mistake. But there was no mistake and everyone in that room knew it. My name is Maya Harrison, and I am 33 years old. I live in Portland, Oregon, where the rain falls like a constant gentle reminder that growth requires both sunshine and storms, and where the evergreen trees stand as testament to the possibility of remaining vibrant, even through the darkest winters. The city has been my sanctuary for the past decade, a place where I built myself from absolutely nothing into someone I could finally respect when I looked in the mirror each morning. I grew up in a deteriorating suburb of Sacramento, California, the kind of neighborhood where chain-link fences separated identical tract homes and dreams seemed to shrivel under the relentless valley heat. I was the middle child in my family, which in most circumstances would mean being overlooked or forgotten in the shuffle between the accomplished firstborn and the coddled baby. In my particular family dynamic, being the middle child meant something far more specific and painful. It meant being the problem, the disappointment, the one who never quite measured up to the standards my parents had established with my older sister or the potential they still harbored for my younger brother. My sister Victoria came first, arriving into the world with what seemed like a predetermined script for success. She was academically gifted without apparent effort, socially graceful in ways that made adults beam with approval, and physically blessed with the kind of classical beauty that opened doors before she even had to knock. She graduated as valedictorian of her high school class, attended Stanford University on a full academic scholarship, and went on to marry a successful corporate attorney who came from old money and impeccable social connections. By every conventional measure my parents valued, Victoria was the golden child who had fulfilled every hope they had ever dared to dream. My brother Derek arrived 6 years after me, the surprise baby who became the center of my parents' universe from his first breath. He was charming and charismatic, the kind of child who could talk his way out of any consequence and into any opportunity. My parents saw endless potential in him, convinced that his natural charm and intelligence would translate into extraordinary success once he finally found his true calling. They funded his various entrepreneurial ventures, supported him through multiple college major changes, and continued to believe in his imminent breakthrough long after any objective observer would have recognized a pattern of unfulfilled promises. And then there was me, sandwiched between perfection and potential, never managing to achieve the heights of one or embody the promise of the other. I was average in school, not because I lacked intelligence but because I never seemed to grasp information the way my teachers presented it. I struggled with traditional testing formats, my mind working in tangential patterns that produce correct answers through unconventional paths that earned me no credit for my work. I was physically awkward through adolescence, shooting up to 5 feet 10 inches by the time I was 13 and spending years learning how to inhabit a body that felt perpetually too large, too clumsy, too visible in all the wrong ways. My parents never quite knew what to do with me, this daughter who fit none of their established categories for success or promise. And so, gradually and then completely, I became the burden. Not in the way that all children burden their parents with the normal demands of raising a human being, but in a specific, frequently articulated way that left no doubt about my position in the family hierarchy. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became such a common refrain that I stopped hearing it as a question and started understanding it as a simple statement of fact about my fundamental inadequacy. When Victoria brought home straighter report cards, my parents displayed them on the refrigerator with magnetic frames and called relatives to share the news. When I brought home B's and C's despite working twice as hard, my mother would sigh heavily and ask what I had done wrong this time, what I had failed to understand or properly apply myself to. When Derek expressed interest in learning guitar, my parents immediately purchased him a top-of-the-line instrument and enrolled him in private lessons with the best teacher in our area. When I asked if I could take art classes at the community center, my mother informed me that we could not afford frivolous expenses for hobbies that would not contribute to my future earning potential. The word burden first entered our family vocabulary during a particularly difficult financial period, when I was 14 years old. My father had been laid off from his middle management position at a manufacturing company, and my mother's part-time administrative work barely covered the household utilities. Victoria was already at Stanford by then, her education fully funded by scholarships and grants that required nothing from my parents except their pride in her achievements. Derek was only 8 years old, still young enough that his expenses were relatively minimal and his future potential remained an investment worth making in my parents' eyes. But I was 14, requiring school supplies and clothes for my growing body and occasional field trip fees that my parents paid with visible resentment. I overheard them arguing one night in the kitchen, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our cramped house. "We're barely keeping our heads above water, and Maya just keeps needing things," my mother said, her voice tight with stress and frustration. "She's such a burden right now. I don't know how we're supposed to keep up with everything she requires." My father's response was quieter, but I caught the essential agreement in his tone. "Victoria never cost us anything like this. She earned her own way. And Derek, well, he's worth the investment. But Maya..." He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished, but the implication was devastatingly clear. I was not worth the investment. I was simply a burden to be endured until I was old enough to remove myself from their financial responsibility. From that night forward, I heard the word applied to me regularly, sometimes directly to my face and other times in conversations I was clearly meant to overhear. When I needed new shoes because I had outgrown my old ones, my mother complained about the burden of my constantly growing feet. When I asked for money to attend my school's winter formal dance, my father lectured me about adding unnecessary burdens to the family budget during difficult times. When I got sick with pneumonia and required antibiotics and follow-up doctor visits, I heard them discussing the burden of my medical expenses in the hallway outside my bedroom while I lay fevered and aching in my bed. The label became so deeply embedded in my self-concept that I started to believe it myself. I was a burden, an unwanted expense, a problem that my parents had to solve until I was legally old enough to solve myself. I began working at 15, taking a job at a local grocery store bagging purchases, and collecting shopping carts from the parking lot. I used my earnings to buy my own clothes, my own school supplies, my own everything, desperate to reduce the burden I represented and perhaps earn some small measure of my parents' approval through my self-sufficiency. But self-sufficiency, I learned, could also be used against me. When I stopped asking them for money, they pointed to my independence as evidence that I had never really needed them in the first place. When I bought my own homecoming dress with money I had earned through 40 hours of weekend work, my mother remarked that I had always been the child who did not require parenting, who raised herself without needing the guidance and support that Victoria and Derek had welcomed. The narrative shifted seamlessly from Maya is a burden to Maya never needed us anyway, absolving them of any responsibility for the emotional distance that had grown between us. The specific incident that had brought us all to the bank on this particular Tuesday afternoon had begun 3 weeks earlier with a phone call I had not wanted to answer. My mother's name appeared on my phone screen at 9:30 on a Saturday morning, and I stared at it with the familiar combination of obligation and dread that characterized all our communications. We spoke perhaps once every 2 months, brief conversations where she updated me on Victoria's professional accomplishments and Derek's latest business venture, while asking me perfunctory questions about my life that she clearly had no genuine interest in hearing answered. But I answered the call, as I always did, because some deeply ingrained sense of daughterly duty overrode my better judgment. "Maya, we have a serious problem," my mother said without preamble, her voice carrying the sharp edge of panic that I had learned to recognize as the sound of an impending request. "The bank is threatening foreclosure on the house. We're 6 months behind on the mortgage, and they're saying we have 30 days to bring the account current or they'll begin proceedings." I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against my forehead, feeling the tension headache that was already beginning to form. This was not the first financial crisis my parents had experienced, nor was it the first time they had turned to me in desperation after exhausting all other options. Have you talked to Victoria about this? I asked, knowing the answer before the question fully left my mouth. Your sister has her own family to support now, my mother replied, her tone suggesting that I had asked something ridiculous and slightly offensive. She and Thomas just bought that beautiful new house in Palo Alto, and the children are in private school. We couldn't possibly ask her to help with something like this. The implication was clear as it had always been. Victoria's money and resources were precious and protected, not to be troubled with my parents' problems. My money, whatever I might have, was somehow more available, more expendable, more appropriate to be claimed for family emergencies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What about Derek? I pressed, though I knew this answer as well. Didn't he tell you his new tech startup just got seed funding? My mother made a dismissive sound. That funding has to go directly back into the business. Derek can't touch it for personal expenses. You know how important this venture is for him. This could finally be his big breakthrough. The protective tone she used when discussing my brother's perpetually impending success was so familiar it barely registered as painful anymore. How much do you need? I asked, feeling the words pulled from me by invisible strings of obligation and old programming that insisted family helped family, even when that help only ever flowed in one direction. $48,000, my mother said quickly, as though getting the number out fast would somehow make it less staggering. That covers the 6 months we're behind plus the penalties and fees. If we can just get current, we can manage the monthly payments going forward. I was silent for a long moment, calculating rapidly in my head. I had been saving aggressively for years, living well below my means and investing carefully. I had built a substantial emergency fund, and was working toward a down payment on my own property. $48,000 would eliminate nearly all my liquid savings, setting my personal goals back by at least 2 years. I'll need to think about it, I said finally. Think about it? My mother's voice rose sharply. Maya, we're talking about losing the house. The home you grew up in. Where are we supposed to go if the bank forecloses? We're not young anymore, we can't just start over somewhere else. The emotional manipulation was so transparent and so well practiced that I almost admired the efficiency of it. I said I need to think about it, I repeated, my voice firmer this time. This is a significant amount of money, and I need to consider my options and the implications. My mother's tone shifted from panic to something colder and more cutting. Of course you need to think about it. You've always been the selfish one, haven't you? Always thinking about yourself first while the rest of us actually care about family. The accusation landed with practiced precision, aimed at the guilt centers she had spent decades conditioning. I ended the call shortly after, promising to give her an answer within a week. Then I sat on my couch in my small but carefully decorated apartment and tried to untangle the knot of obligation, resentment, and deeply programmed family loyalty that had been tightening in my chest since childhood. The rational part of my brain knew that giving them this money would solve nothing in the long term, that their financial mismanagement would continue, that I would be called upon again and again to fix problems they created. But the wounded child who still lived somewhere inside me whispered that maybe this time would be different, that maybe this grand gesture of salvation would finally earn me the love and recognition I had craved for 33 years. I spent 3 days researching options, consulting with a financial advisor, and lying awake at night playing out various scenarios in my mind. Finally, I called my mother back with my decision. I'll pay the mortgage, I told her. But not as a one-time bailout. I'm going to take over the mortgage payments entirely going forward. What do you mean? My mother asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. I mean, I will pay your mortgage every month from now on. I'll bring your account current with the bank, and then I'll make the monthly payments directly. You won't have to worry about it anymore. I kept my voice level and businesslike, treating this like the financial transaction it was rather than the emotionally loaded family intervention it represented. There was a long pause. Why would you do that? Because giving you a lump sum will just delay the inevitable, I said bluntly. You'll fall behind again in 6 months or a year, and we'll be right back here. This way, the house is protected, and you can use your income for other expenses. I could hear her discussing this with my father in muffled tones, their hands clearly covering the phone receiver. When she came back on the line, Her voice carried grudging acceptance. Fine. If that's what you want to do. I'll contact the bank tomorrow to set up the payment arrangement, I told her. But I want something understood clearly. This doesn't mean I'm suddenly your emergency fund for every financial problem. This is specifically for the house, nothing more. Of course, my mother said quickly, too quickly. We would never expect anything more from you. But we both knew that was a lie, just as we both knew I would probably help again when they called, because whatever else had happened between us, they were still my parents and I was still their daughter, still carrying the burden of daughterly duty even as I carried the literal burden of their mortgage. I contacted the bank the following Monday and arranged everything through a helpful loan officer named Jennifer Chan. The bank was relieved to have the account brought current and to have a reliable payment source established going forward. I set up automatic monthly transfers from my checking account to their mortgage account, creating a system that required no ongoing involvement or reminder from my parents. The debt I had been carrying became literal rather than metaphorical, a monthly line item in my budget that represented my parents' roof over their heads. For 7 years I made those payments without fail. Through my own career changes and apartment moves, through a serious relationship that ended badly and a health crisis that depleted my emergency fund, through recessions and raises in every circumstance of my own life, that mortgage payment went out on the first of every month like clockwork. My parents never thanked me. Not once in 7 years did they acknowledge what I was doing for them beyond that initial grudging acceptance of my offer. Instead, I continued to be the burden in their narrative. When I couldn't afford to fly home for Derek's 30th birthday celebration because I had used my vacation budget to cover an unexpected car repair, my mother told relatives I was too selfish to prioritize family. When I declined to contribute to Victoria's elaborate anniversary party because I was still rebuilding my savings after a medical emergency, my father remarked that I had always been tight with money, never generous the way truly good people were generous. The word burden appeared in our conversations regularly, casually deployed as an established fact about my character and my role in the family. I know it's a burden for you to visit, my mother would say when I explained I couldn't make it home for Thanksgiving. You've always found family obligations to be such a burden. The irony was so profound it would have been laughable if it had not been so deeply painful. And through all of it, I never told them that I knew what the word burden actually meant. I never threw their mortgage payments back in their faces during arguments. I never used my financial support as leverage or demanded recognition. Some part of me, the part that had been conditioned since age 14 to minimize my needs and my worth, believed that their good opinion had to be earned through silence and service rather than demanded through confrontation. Until 3 weeks ago, when my mother called to inform me that they had decided to refinance the house. We're getting a much better interest rate, she explained enthusiastically. The bank said we have excellent payment history for the past 7 years, and we qualify for their best terms. We just need you to come down to sign some paperwork. Why would I need to sign paperwork for your refinancing? I asked, confused about why I would be involved in their financial transaction. Oh, didn't I mention? My mother's voice carried artificial lightness. We're adding you to the title of the house. Since you've been so involved with the property, we thought it made sense to make you part owner. That way everything will be simpler when we eventually pass away. Something in her tone raised immediate red flags, some quality of forced casualness that suggested she was not telling me the complete truth about this situation. I need to see the actual documents before I agree to anything, I said firmly. Have the bank send them to my email address. The documents arrived 2 days later, and I immediately forwarded them to a real estate attorney I knew through work connections. His response came back within hours and confirmed my suspicions. The refinancing was not simply for a better interest rate. My parents were pulling equity out of the house, borrowing an additional $150,000 against the property value. And by adding me to the title, they were making me equally responsible for this new larger debt. I called my mother immediately, my hands shaking with rage as I gripped my phone. You're trying to trap me into a bigger mortgage without even asking me, I said without preamble when she answered. Did you really think I wouldn't notice what you were doing? It's not like that, my mother protested. We need that money for important expenses. Derek's business needs an infusion of capital to really take off. And Victoria wants to buy a vacation property that the whole family can use. We're thinking of everyone, not just ourselves. You're borrowing $150,000 to fund Derek's failing business and Victoria's vacation home. And you expect me to be responsible for the debt? My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm, while continuing to call me a burden. Don't be so dramatic, my mother snapped. You've been paying the mortgage anyway. What difference does it make if the payment is slightly higher? You're being selfish about this as usual. That was when I made the decision that led to this moment in the bank lobby. I'll meet you at the bank, I told her coldly. But we're going to have a very different conversation than the one you're anticipating. Which was how we all ended up standing in front of Jennifer Chen's desk on this rainy Tuesday afternoon, my parents expecting me to quietly sign documents that would legally obligate me to their expanded debt, and me preparing to finally shatter the carefully constructed narrative they had built about their burden of a daughter. I think there's been some confusion about the mortgage situation, I said to Jennifer, my voice steady and clear despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. Can you please explain to my parents who has actually been paying their mortgage for the past 7 years? Jennifer glanced between us uncertainly, clearly sensing the tension in the air but not understanding its source. Well, according to our records, Maya Harrison has been making all the payments on this mortgage since November of 2016. The payments come directly from her checking account via automatic transfer. My mother's face went blank. That careful blankness that meant she was processing information she did not want to accept. That can't be right, she said slowly. We've been paying our mortgage. No, ma'am, Jennifer said gently, pulling up account records on her computer screen and turning the monitor so my parents could see. These are all payments from Maya's account. There have been no payments from your personal accounts during this period. My father finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Maya has been paying our entire mortgage? For 7 years. Yes, sir. Every payment on time, never missed once. Jennifer was clearly becoming uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in her professional space, but she continued with professional courtesy. That's actually why we were willing to offer you such favorable refinancing terms. The payment history is impeccable. And that was when my mother said it, her voice sharp with defensive anger. Her face flushed with an emotion that might have been shame but looked more like fury at being caught in an uncomfortable truth. You've always been such a burden on this family. The words hung in the air, so absurdly disconnected from the reality Jennifer had just revealed that for a moment I wondered if everyone else could hear the same dissonance I was experiencing. Jennifer's face went pale, her eyes widening as she looked at my mother with transparent shock, then at me with something that might have been pity or perhaps recognition. I'm sorry, Mrs. Harrison, Jennifer said, her voice carrying a steel I had not heard before. But are you aware that your daughter Maya has been paying your mortgage for the past 7 years? The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. In that moment, standing in the bank lobby with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the scent of coffee drifting from the break room, 33 years of carefully constructed family mythology crumbled into dust. The burden they had spent decades defining me as had been paying for the roof over their heads while they called her selfish, ungrateful, and eternally insufficient. My mother's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. My father stood frozen, his face drained of all color. And I felt something break open inside my chest. Not the painful breaking of something precious being destroyed, but the liberating breaking of chains I had worn so long I had forgotten they were there at all. I won't be signing the refinancing documents, I said quietly, my voice steady and clear. And I won't be making any more mortgage payments after this month. You have 30 days to make other arrangements. I turned and walked out of the bank without waiting for their response, without looking back to see the devastation I was leaving behind. The rain had started falling harder, drops pattering against the sidewalk in a rhythm that matched my racing heartbeat. I stood under the bank's awning for a moment, tilting my face up to catch the cool mist, and felt something I had not experienced in longer than I could remember. I felt free. The drive back to my apartment took 45 minutes through Portland's typical afternoon rain. The kind of persistent drizzle that transforms the city into a watercolor painting where all the edges blur softly into one another. I gripped the steering wheel with hands that had finally stopped trembling, watching the wipers sweep across my windshield in their rhythmic pattern, clearing my vision only to have it obscured again moments later. It felt like an appropriate metaphor for the past 7 years of my life, constantly working to maintain clarity only to have it clouded repeatedly by family dynamics I could never quite escape. My apartment was located in the Hawthorne district, a neighborhood known for its eclectic mix of vintage shops, independent bookstores, and the kind of coffee roasters that take their craft so seriously it borders on religious devotion. I had chosen this area deliberately when I first moved to Portland a decade ago, drawn to its creative energy and the sense that people here valued authenticity over appearances, substance over social performance. The tree-lined streets felt worlds away from the cookie-cutter Sacramento suburb where I had grown up, where conformity was prized and deviation from expected patterns was met with suspicion and judgment. I parked in my designated spot behind the 1920s-era building that housed my one-bedroom apartment and sat for a moment in the silence after cutting the engine. Rain drummed steadily on the roof of my car, creating a cocoon of white noise that felt oddly comforting. My phone had been buzzing intermittently throughout the drive, notifications lighting up the screen with what I assumed were increasingly frantic messages from my parents. I had not looked at a single one, and I had no intention of doing so tonight. For the first time in my adult life, I was allowing myself to prioritize my own peace over their demands for immediate response and emotional labor. The apartment building was called the Morrison, named after one of Portland's main bridges, and it had been my home for the past 6 years. I had moved here after living in 3 different places during my first 4 years in the city, each apartment slightly better than the last as my career progressed and my income increased. The Morrison represented the first time I had felt truly settled, the first place that felt like mine rather than just a temporary stopping point on the way to somewhere else. The building had been lovingly restored by owners who respected its historical character while updating essential systems, maintaining the original hardwood floors and crown molding, while installing modern plumbing and electrical work that actually functioned reliably. My unit was on the 3rd floor, a corner apartment with windows facing both east and south, allowing morning light to flood the space and creating the illusion of more square footage than the floor plan technically provided. I had furnished it carefully over the years, selecting each piece with intention rather than impulse, building a home that reflected my actual taste, rather than some aspirational magazine aesthetic I thought I should want. The result was a space that felt deeply comfortable and authentically mine, filled with warm wood tones, jewel-colored textiles, and an eclectic collection of artwork from local artists whose work spoke to something true in my experience. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs feeling heavy with exhaustion that was more emotional than physical. The confrontation at the bank had drained something essential from me, leaving me feeling hollowed out in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. It was the emptiness that comes after finally releasing something you have been carrying for far too long. The strange lightness that follows setting down a burden you had forgotten was not permanently attached to your body. My hands shook slightly as I unlocked my door, and I stepped inside to the familiar comfort of my carefully curated sanctuary. The apartment smelled faintly of the lavender sachets I kept in my linen closet, and the coffee I had brewed that morning before driving down to Sacramento for what I had expected to be a quick signing of documents. The living room was exactly as I had left it, my laptop still open on the vintage desk I had restored myself, a half-finished mug of tea sitting on a coaster beside a stack of books I was perpetually in the middle of reading. Everything was orderly and peaceful, a physical manifestation of the life I had built entirely on my own terms, without my family's help or approval or even their basic awareness of what I had accomplished. I set my purse and keys on the entry table and walked to the large window that overlooked Hawthorne Boulevard. 3 stories below, people moved along the sidewalks with umbrellas tilted against the rain, ducking into coffee shops and bookstores, living their lives in the ordinary, extraordinary way that city dwellers do. I watched them for a long moment, these strangers whose problems and triumphs I would never know, and felt a strange kinship with their anonymous struggles. We were all carrying invisible weights, all performing complex emotional mathematics to balance what we owed others against what we owed ourselves. My phone buzzed again in my purse, the vibration audible even from across the room. I ignored it and instead walked to my small kitchen, pouring myself a glass of wine from a bottle I had been saving for a special occasion. If finally liberating yourself from 3 decades of emotional manipulation did not qualify as special, I could not imagine what would. The wine was a Willamette Valley Pinot Noir, produced by a small family vineyard I had visited during a rare weekend trip to wine country 2 years ago. I had purchased 3 bottles that day, intending to share them with people who mattered during meaningful moments. I had never found the right occasion, always waiting for something that felt significant enough to merit opening something I had been saving. Tonight felt significant enough. I carried my wine glass back to the living room and settled into my favorite chair. A mid-century modern piece I had found at an estate sale and reupholstered in deep teal velvet. The chair sat angled toward the window, positioned perfectly to watch both the street below and the changing sky above the city's modest skyline. I pulled my feet up underneath me and allowed myself to simply exist in the moment without planning my next move or analyzing what had just happened or preparing for the inevitable confrontations that would follow. The truth was settling into my bones with a weight that felt both heavy and somehow stabilizing, like ballast in a ship that had been listing dangerously to one side. For 7 years, I had been paying my parents' mortgage while they called me a burden. For 7 years, I had been ensuring they kept their home while they told relatives I was selfish and ungrateful. For 7 years, I had been carrying them financially while they criticized my character to anyone who would listen. The sheer audacity of it would have been almost impressive if it had not been so personally devastating. But beneath the hurt and anger, there was something else emerging. Something I had not expected to feel in the immediate aftermath of such a confrontation. I felt validated in a way I had never experienced before. Jennifer Chen's shocked face when my mother called me a burden, the transparent disbelief in her eyes as she looked at my parents and then back at me, had confirmed what I had always suspected but never quite allowed myself to fully believe. The problem had never been me. The burden had never been me. I had been carrying them, not the other way around, and now someone outside our family dynamic had witnessed this truth and reflected it back to us with the clarity of objective observation. My name is Maya Harrison, and I am 33 years old. And I have spent the vast majority of my life trying to earn love from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it to me in any form I could recognize or accept. This realization was not new exactly. I had been in therapy on and off for years, working through family dynamics and attachment patterns, and all the psychological language we use to describe the simple truth that some parents damage their children not through dramatic abuse, but through persistent, corrosive neglect and emotional manipulation. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it viscerally in your body are two entirely different experiences. Sitting in that bank lobby, watching my mother's face as she tried to reconcile her narrative about her burden of a daughter with the documented evidence of 7 years of mortgage payments I had made, I had felt the truth of my situation in a way that bypassed all my usual intellectual defenses and landed directly in my gut. They had been wrong about me. They had always been wrong about me. And I had wasted decades of my life trying to prove otherwise to people who were invested in maintaining their distorted perception regardless of any evidence I presented. I took a long sip of my wine, savoring the complex flavors and the warmth that spread through my chest. The Pinot Noir was exactly as I remembered from my tasting 2 years ago, earthy and elegant with notes of cherry and subtle spice that lingered pleasantly on my palate. I made a mental note to visit that vineyard again soon, to support the family who had crafted this beautiful wine, and perhaps to remind myself that some families actually functioned with mutual respect and shared labor toward common goals. The rain continued to fall steadily outside my window, and I watched the streetlights begin to flicker on as afternoon transitioned into evening. Portland in the rain had a particular quality of coziness that I had grown to love deeply over my decade here. A sense that the whole city was collectively agreeing to slow down and turn inward, to light candles and read books and have deep conversations over coffee that had gone cold while you talked. This was the life I had built for myself, the sanctuary I had created from absolutely nothing, and it was good and valuable and enough exactly as it was. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, the vibration pattern indicating an actual phone call, rather than a text message. I pulled it from my purse and looked at the screen, unsurprised to see my mother's name displayed. I watched it ring 4 times before going to voicemail, then watched as a voicemail notification appeared moments later. The missed call counter showed 12 missed calls total, along with what appeared to be more than 20 text messages. The sheer volume of attempted contact would have triggered my guilt response yesterday, would have sent me into an anxious spiral about what emergency might require such persistent effort to reach me. Today it just made me tired. Tired of being the one who always had to respond immediately, who always had to prioritize their crises over my own peace, who always had to set aside my boundaries the moment they decided those boundaries were inconvenient. I silenced my phone completely and set it face down on the side table, removing even the temptation to check the messages or listen to the voicemail. Whatever they had to say could wait until I was ready to hear it, which might be tomorrow or might be never. For the first time in my life, I was claiming the right to decide when and how I engaged with my family rather than allowing them to dictate the terms of every interaction. The apartment was quiet except for the rain and the distant sounds of the city filtering up from the street below. I closed my eyes and allowed myself to simply breathe, focusing on the physical sensation of air moving in and out of my lungs, the feeling of the velvet upholstery against my skin, the taste of wine still lingering on my tongue. These sensory experiences felt more real and more important than the dozens of messages undoubtedly accumulating on my silenced phone, more worthy of my attention than whatever justifications or accusations my parents were frantically composing. I had not always been this person, this woman who could set boundaries and maintain them despite external pressure. The journey to this third-floor apartment in Portland had been long and circuitous, marked by false starts and backsliding and moments of such profound doubt that I had nearly given up entirely on the project of building a life separate from my family's dysfunction. But I had persisted, driven by some stubborn core of self-preservation that refused to be completely extinguished no matter how many times my family tried to convince me that my needs and feelings were burdensome impositions on their more important lives. I opened my eyes and looked around my living room with fresh appreciation for everything it represented. The bookshelf I had built myself from reclaimed wood, lined with volumes I had actually read rather than displayed for appearances. The gallery wall of framed artwork, each piece selected because it moved something in me, rather than because it matched my color scheme. The plants thriving in their carefully chosen locations, evidence that I could nurture living things and help them flourish. The vintage rug I had saved for months to afford, purchased from a woman who told me stories about her grandmother, who had woven it decades ago in a small village in Turkey. Every object in this space had been chosen with intention and care, purchased with money I had earned through my own labor, arranged according to my own aesthetic preferences. Nothing here had been inherited from my parents or selected to please them or positioned to impress visitors who might judge me for my choices. This was my home in the truest sense, a physical manifestation of my inner life made external and tangible. And it was beautiful not because it looked like anything from a magazine but because it was authentically mine. The sky outside had darkened to the deep gray that passes for night during Portland's rainy season, when clouds reflect the city's ambient light and create an atmospheric glow that never quite becomes complete darkness. I stood and moved to the kitchen to prepare something for dinner, suddenly aware that I had not eaten since breakfast and my body required fuel regardless of the emotional upheaval of the day. I pulled ingredients from my well-stocked refrigerator, the simple act of cooking serving as a meditation that allowed my mind to process while my hands stayed busy with familiar tasks. I made myself a simple pasta with vegetables from the farmer's market I visited every Saturday morning, the routine of chopping and sautéing and stirring providing a rhythm that felt grounding and restorative. The smell of garlic and olive oil filled my small kitchen, homey and comforting, and I found myself humming quietly as I cooked. This was self-care in its most fundamental form, the act of feeding myself well because I deserved nourishment and pleasure, because my body was worth the effort of proper care even when no one was watching to approve or judge my choices. I ate my dinner at the small table by the window, watching the rain and the passing cars and the illuminated windows of the buildings across the street. Other people were having their own evenings, eating their own dinners, managing their own complicated relationships and emotional landscapes. The thought was oddly comforting. This reminder that I was not alone in struggling with family dysfunction, or learning to set boundaries or discovering that the narratives we are told about ourselves often have very little to do with who we actually are. After dinner, I washed my single plate and fork and wine glass, returning my kitchen to its baseline state of order. The small act of cleaning up after myself felt significant in a way I could not quite articulate, some symbolic gesture of taking responsibility for my own life and my own space. I had been doing this for years, of course, living independently and managing a household, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like claiming something that had always been mine but that I had somehow been convinced to doubt or diminish. I returned to my favorite chair with a second, smaller glass of wine, and finally allowed myself to think about what would come next. My parents would not accept my withdrawal of financial support without a fight. They would call and text and possibly even show up at my apartment, armed with guilt and accusations and carefully constructed narratives designed to make me question my decision. My sister Victoria would undoubtedly be recruited to apply pressure, positioned as the voice of reason asking me to reconsider my selfishness. My brother Derek would likely be kept in the dark about the whole situation, protected from knowing that his business investment had been funded by mortgage debt his burden of a sister had been quietly paying. But for the first time in my life, I felt genuinely prepared to withstand that pressure. The scene in the bank had cracked something open, had allowed light into spaces that had been dark for so long I had forgotten they could be illuminated. Jennifer Chen's shocked face kept replaying in my mind, her transparent disbelief serving as external validation that my perception of reality was accurate. I was not crazy or oversensitive or misremembering. I had been paying their mortgage for 7 years while they called me a burden, and that objective fact could not be argued away or reframed, no matter how skilled they were at manipulating narratives. I thought about the life I had built here in Portland, the career I had developed entirely through my own efforts, the community I had cultivated among people who actually valued and respected me. I worked as a senior financial analyst for a sustainable investment firm, a position I had earned through years of study and professional development, and the kind of persistent competence that eventually becomes impossible to overlook. My colleagues respected my insights and analysis. My supervisor had nominated me for a promotion just last month. I had built a professional reputation based on reliability and intelligence, and the ability to see patterns others missed. That woman, the competent professional who showed up every day and did excellent work and contributed meaningfully to her organization, was the real Maya Harrison. Not the burden my parents had spent decades convincing me I was, not the selfish daughter they described to relatives, not the disappointing middle child who could never measure up to her golden siblings. Those characterizations had been convenient fictions that allowed them to avoid confronting their own failures as parents, narratives that served their psychological needs, rather than describing any objective truth about who I actually was. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against my windows with renewed intensity. I pulled a soft blanket over my legs and allowed myself to imagine what life might look like going forward without the weight of their mortgage on my shoulders. An extra $1,400 every month that could go toward my own goals and dreams, rather than subsidizing their ability to maintain a house they could not afford. The possibility of saving for my own property, of building equity for myself rather than for people who would never acknowledge or appreciate my sacrifice. The freedom to make financial decisions based on my own priorities, rather than their emergencies and demands. But more than the money, I imagined the emotional freedom of no longer being tethered to their dysfunction. No more guilt-laden phone calls asking for emergency funds. No more carefully managed conversations where I tried to share my accomplishments only to be met with dismissive indifference or immediate redirection to my siblings' more important updates. No more holiday visits where I performed the role of grateful daughter, while being treated like an unwelcome obligation. No more pretending that their treatment of me was normal or acceptable or anything other than what it actually was. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. I had spent 33 years existing within their framework, accepting their definitions of me even as I tried to prove those definitions wrong. What would it mean to simply step outside that framework entirely, to build a life that did not reference their approval or disapproval at all? Who was Maya Harrison when she was not desperately trying to be enough for people who had decided long ago that she would never be enough regardless of what she achieved? I was about to find out, I realized. The confrontation at the bank had been the catalyst, but the real transformation would happen in the days and weeks and months ahead, as I learned to inhabit my life without the weight of their expectations and criticisms. It would not be easy, I knew. Decades of conditioning did not evaporate overnight, and I would undoubtedly struggle with guilt and doubt and the persistent voice in my head that had been trained to tell me I was being selfish whenever I prioritized my own needs. But I also knew I had resources I had not possessed at 14, when I had first been labeled a burden. I had therapy and close friends and professional success, and the hard-won knowledge that I could survive disappointment and still build something beautiful from the wreckage. I had this apartment in this city and this life that I had created entirely on my own merits. And I had, finally, the objective validation of a bank manager's shocked face when my mother called me a burden while standing over evidence of 7 years of payments I had made on her behalf. That validation mattered more than I had expected it to. For so long I had doubted my own perceptions, wondering if maybe my parents were right and I was just being oversensitive or misremembering or failing to see things from their perspective. But Jennifer Chen's reaction had confirmed that an outside observer with no stake in our family dynamics found my mother's statement shocking and inappropriate, given the documented facts. I was not crazy. My perceptions were accurate. And I deserved better than what they had given me. The wine glass was empty again, and I decided against pouring a third. I needed clarity for whatever tomorrow would bring. Needed to be fully present for the conversations and confrontations that would inevitably follow my decision to stop enabling their financial irresponsibility. I carried my glass to the kitchen and washed it carefully, then returned to the living room to prepare for bed even though it was barely 8 o'clock in the evening. But first, I did one small act of rebellion against my usual patterns. I picked up my silence phone and without reading any of the accumulated messages or listening to the voicemails, I composed a single text message to my parents. The words came easily, flowing from some deep well of clarity that the day's events had opened within me. I will not be making any more mortgage payments after this month, I typed carefully. You have 30 days to make other financial arrangements. I am also taking a break from family contact for the foreseeable future. Please respect this boundary. I will reach out when and if I am ready to resume communication. I read it over twice, considering whether to soften the language or add explanatory details that might make them feel less attacked. Then I thought about Jennifer Chen's face, about 7 years of payments I had made while being called a burden, about all the times I had softened my words and managed their feelings and prioritized their comfort over my own truth. I hit send without changing a single word. The message showed as delivered, then read almost immediately. The 3 dots appeared indicating someone was typing a response. I watched them pulse for a moment, then turned off my phone completely and plugged it in to charge in another room, removing even the temptation to see what they had written. Whatever they had to say could wait until I had slept and recovered some of my emotional resources. Tonight I was choosing myself. Tonight I was being the burden they had always accused me of being by finally, actually prioritizing my own needs over theirs. And it felt like the first honest thing I had done in years. I woke the next morning to weak sunlight filtering through my curtains, the rain having finally cleared during the night to reveal one of those crystalline Portland mornings where everything looks washed clean and newly made. The air coming through my slightly open window carried the scent of wet earth and the faint perfume of the flowering trees that lined my street. For a brief, disoriented moment before full consciousness returned, I felt peaceful and rested in a way I had not experienced in months. Then I remembered the previous day's confrontation at the bank, and my stomach clenched with a complex mixture of anxiety and satisfaction. I had finally drawn a line, finally said the things that needed saying, finally stopped protecting my parents from the consequences of their own financial irresponsibility and emotional manipulation. The knowledge sat heavy in my chest, not quite regret but not quite triumph either. It was something more complicated, the weight of truth finally spoken after years of careful silence. I reached for my phone from the nightstand where I had plugged it in after moving it from the living room, then remembered I had turned it off completely. I held the dark screen in my hand for a long moment, debating whether I was ready to face whatever messages awaited me. The old Maya, the one who had existed until yesterday, would have turned it on immediately, would have spent her first waking moments managing whatever crisis my parents had manufactured overnight. The new Maya, the one who was learning to prioritize her own peace, set the phone back down and went to make coffee instead. My small kitchen filled with the rich aroma of freshly ground beans, a weekly splurge I allowed myself from a local roaster who sourced ethically and paid farmers fairly. I had learned over the years that these small acts of quality and care in my daily routine mattered more than I had initially understood. They were affirmations that I deserved good things, that my comfort and pleasure were worthy of investment, that I did not have to accept the bare minimum just because that was what I had been conditioned to expect. I carried my coffee to the window seat in my bedroom, a cozy nook I had created with cushions and throw pillows where I often sat to watch the morning light transform the city. The view from my third-floor window encompassed a section of tree-lined street, the rooftops of neighboring buildings, and a slice of the West Hills rising in the distance. It was not a dramatic vista, but it was mine, and I had learned to find profound satisfaction in these small beauties that filled my daily life. As I sipped my coffee and watched the neighborhood wake up around me, I found myself thinking about how I had arrived at this particular morning, this specific moment of rupture with my family. The origin of our dysfunction was not a single dramatic event, but rather a slow accumulation of small wounds and casual cruelties that had calcified over decades into something that felt immovable and eternal. To understand yesterday's confrontation, I needed to trace the roots back to where everything had first gone wrong, to examine the soil in which such toxic dynamics had been allowed to grow unchecked. My parents, Robert and Linda Harrison, had married young, both of them barely 21 when they stood at the altar of a small community church in Sacramento, and made promises they were too inexperienced to fully understand. My mother had been raised by a single father after her own mother died when she was only 7 years old, and she carried deep insecurities about her worth and lovability that she had never addressed through therapy or honest self-examination. My father came from a large working-class family where emotions were never discussed, and practical concerns always took precedence over psychological needs. They were both seeking something in marriage that the other person could never provide. My mother wanted unconditional love and validation she had never received as a child. My father wanted a traditional household that would give him the status and stability his chaotic childhood had lacked. Neither of them possessed the emotional tools or self-awareness to communicate these needs clearly, much less to meet them for each other. And so they settled into a pattern of mutual disappointment disguised as functional partnership, each resenting the other for failing to heal wounds they had never acknowledged existed. Into this already strained dynamic, I was born 2 years after their wedding. My arrival was not planned, though my mother insisted throughout my childhood that I had been wanted once they knew I was coming. I never quite believed this reassurance, having heard too many offhand comments about how my unexpected pregnancy had derailed their plans to save money and buy a house. I was simultaneously wanted and resented, loved in the abstract but experienced as an inconvenient disruption to their vision of how their early marriage should have unfolded. My mother told me once, during a rare moment of candor when I was in my 20s, that I had been a difficult baby, colicky and fussy, rarely sleeping for more than 2 hours at a stretch, resistant to the feeding and sleeping schedules the parenting books of that era insisted were essential for raising well-adjusted children. She described those early months with a weariness that suggested she had never quite recovered from the exhaustion, as though my infant self had drained something from her that she had been trying to reclaim ever since. I grew into a serious, watchful child who seemed to intuitively understand that my parents were struggling, even when I lacked the vocabulary to name what I was observing. I learned early to be quiet and undemanding, to anticipate their moods and adjust my behavior accordingly, to make myself as small and unobtrusive as possible to avoid adding to their already considerable stress. These adaptations, which child psychology would later help me understand as hypervigilance and parentification, became so deeply embedded in my personality that I could not remember a time when I had felt free to simply be a child without constantly monitoring the emotional temperature of the adults around me. When I was 3 years old, my mother became pregnant again. This pregnancy was planned and eagerly anticipated, undertaken at a time when my parents felt more financially stable and emotionally prepared for another child. They had specific hopes for this baby, specific visions of how a second child would complete their family, and perhaps repair some of the strain that had characterized my early years. When Victoria arrived, she seemed to fulfill every one of those hopes in ways I apparently never had. The contrast between how my parents responded to Victoria and how they had responded to me was stark enough that even my 3-year-old self registered the difference. Victoria was an easy baby, sleeping peacefully for long stretches and nursing without difficulty. She smiled early and often, her sunny disposition seeming to validate my parents' belief that this time they were doing things right. Where I had been fussy and demanding, she was placid and content. Where I had disrupted their lives, she enhanced them. The implicit message was clear even to my young mind. Victoria was the child they had wanted all along, and I was the difficult rehearsal they had endured before getting it right. My mother's face when she looked at Victoria held a softness I did not remember ever seeing directed at me. My father, who had always seemed vaguely uncomfortable with the demands of infant care, appeared genuinely delighted by his second daughter. Family photographs from that period tell a story that my memory alone might have doubted. In pictures from my infancy, my parents looked tired and stressed, holding me with careful awkwardness. In pictures from Victoria's first years, they look genuinely happy, gazing at her with transparent adoration while I hover at the edges of the frame, watching this scene of family contentment from which I felt obscurely excluded. As Victoria grew from infant to toddler to child, The dynamic only intensified. She was naturally gifted in ways I was not, seeming to absorb information effortlessly, while I struggled to learn through conventional teaching methods. She was physically graceful where I was clumsy, socially intuitive where I was awkward, artistically talented where I labored to produce anything that did not embarrass me with its inadequacy. Every natural advantage she possessed was celebrated and encouraged by my parents, who saw in her the confirmation that they were capable of raising a successful child after all. I tried desperately to find my own areas of excellence, searching for something I could do well enough to earn the same pride and attention my sister received. I joined the school science club and won several local competitions, but my parents never attended the award ceremonies, always citing work conflicts or Victoria's concurrent activities that took precedence. I taught myself to play piano using library books and online tutorials, practicing until my fingers ached, but my parents would not pay for formal lessons the way they immediately did when Victoria expressed even mild interest in dance classes. The message I internalized was not subtle. Victoria's interests and talents were worthy of investment and celebration. Mine were hobbies at best, distractions from the more important work of not being such a burden on the family resources. I learned to stop sharing my small victories and quiet accomplishments, having discovered through painful repetition that doing so only highlighted how little they impressed my parents compared to Victoria's effortless achievements. When I was 9 years old, my mother became pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was unplanned, arriving at a moment when my parents had finally settled into a comfortable rhythm with 2 children, and were beginning to envision their future, as the girls grew more independent. I remember my mother's tears when she told us about the pregnancy, though she insisted they were tears of joy rather than the disappointment I suspected they actually represented. Derek's arrival 6 years after Victoria fundamentally altered our family dynamic yet again. Where Victoria had been the golden child who could do no wrong, Derek became the precious baby whose potential could not be questioned. My parents, now in their mid-30s and feeling the weight of raising 3 children on modest dual incomes, seemed to invest all their hopes for future success in their only son. Derek was special, they insisted, displaying signs of exceptional intelligence and creativity from his earliest years. The truth, which I recognized even as a child but could never voice, was that Derek was indulged in ways neither Victoria nor I had been. Rules that applied to us were relaxed for him. Consequences that we faced for misbehavior were explained away as boyish energy when he committed the same infractions. Where Victoria had earned her status through actual achievement, Derek was granted specialness simply by existing as their long-awaited son, the male heir who would carry on the family name and presumably achieve great things that would make all their sacrifices worthwhile. I watched this dynamic unfold with the clear-eyed observation of a child who had already learned that fairness was not a principle that governed family life. At 9 years old, I was already cooking simple meals for myself when my parents were too busy with the new baby to think about dinner. I was walking myself to and from school, managing my own homework, and handling minor crises without bothering my parents because I understood that their attention was a limited resource that would not be allocated to me unless absolutely necessary. Victoria, at 6, was still coddled and helped with basic tasks, still praised for accomplishments that I had achieved at earlier ages without recognition. Derek, as an infant and then a toddler, consumed vast amounts of parental attention and resources that were framed as essential investments in his promising future. And I learned to make myself invisible, to need nothing, to ask for nothing, to be nothing more than a quiet background presence in a family drama where I had no meaningful role to play. The word burden entered our family vocabulary when I was 14, but the concept had existed long before that. I had always understood myself to be the difficult one, the child who had arrived inconveniently and continued to be inconvenient through her very existence. The financial crisis that made this implicit understanding explicit was almost a relief in its honesty. At least when my mother called me a burden, I knew exactly where I stood rather than having to interpret subtle signals and manage my constant uncertainty about my place in the family hierarchy. My father's unemployment lasted for 8 months, a period of intense financial stress that brought all our family dysfunctions into sharp relief. Victoria was at Stanford by then, successfully launched and requiring nothing from my parents except their pride in her accomplishments. Derek was 8 years old, still young enough that his expenses were relatively minimal, and his future potential seemed unlimited. And I was 14, growing rapidly and needing new clothes and school supplies and all the ordinary expenses of adolescence that suddenly felt like unforgivable impositions on the strained family budget. I heard my parents arguing late at night, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our modest home. My mother's anxiety about money manifested as sharp criticism of any expense that was not absolutely essential. My father's wounded pride at being unemployed made him defensive and withdrawn, unable to handle additional stress or emotional demands. And I, the child who had learned so early to monitor adult moods and adjust my behavior accordingly, tried desperately to make myself cost nothing, need nothing, be nothing but invisible and undemanding. But 14-year-old bodies grow regardless of family finances, and school requires supplies regardless of parental employment status, and life continues to make its ordinary demands even when meeting those demands feels impossibly difficult. Each time I needed something, each time I could not avoid asking for money or help or basic parental support, I felt the weight of being a burden settle more heavily on my shoulders. My parents' sighs of frustration, my mother's comments about my timing being terrible, my father's lectures about understanding the family's financial situation, all reinforced the fundamental truth I had been learning since infancy. I was too much, always too much, an obligation they had never quite wanted and certainly could not afford. Victoria called home regularly from Stanford, her conversations with our parents filled with updates about her impressive academic performance and exciting opportunities she was pursuing. They would get off the phone with her glowing with pride, talking about their brilliant daughter who was making the most of her incredible potential. When I tried to share my own small accomplishments like making the honor roll or winning a writing contest, they responded with distracted praise that felt perfunctory at best. The contrast was so obvious that I eventually stopped trying to compete for attention I was clearly never going to receive. Derek, young enough to be oblivious to the financial stress, continued to receive whatever he asked for within reason. A new video game console for his birthday, despite my mother's insistence that we could not afford any luxuries. An expensive basketball hoop for the driveway because sports were important for his development. Name-brand clothes because he had strong opinions about what he wanted to wear and my parents found it easier to indulge him than to argue. Each purchase for him was framed as an investment in his future, while my more modest needs were characterized as burdens on the already strained budget. I learned during those months to hate myself a little, to internalize the message that my existence was fundamentally problematic, and my needs were unreasonable impositions. I started working as soon as I was legally able to, taking a job at a grocery store the week I turned 15, and using every penny I earned to buy my own necessities, so I would not have to ask my parents for anything. The relief on their faces when I stopped coming to them for money was unmistakable, confirming what I had already understood. They were happier when I required nothing from them, when I could pass through their lives without leaving any mark or making any demand. But even my self-sufficiency became a weapon they used against me. When I stopped asking for help, they reframed my independence as evidence that I had never needed them in the first place. I was naturally self-reliant, they told relatives, unlike Victoria who had always welcomed their guidance and support, or Derek who still needed their active involvement in his life. My ability to manage without them became proof that their neglect was not actually neglect but rather appropriate response to my independent nature. The psychological gymnastics required to maintain this narrative would have been impressive if it had not been so personally devastating. I learned that I could not win regardless of what approach I took. If I asked for help, I was a burden. If I handled things myself, I was evidence that I never needed help in the first place and therefore had no right to complain about not receiving it. The game was rigged from the beginning, the rules designed to ensure that I always came out wrong no matter what choices I made. I spent my high school years in a state of constant low-grade anxiety, waiting for the moment I could leave home and finally stop trying to earn love from people who had decided long ago that I was not worth the effort of loving. I applied to colleges as far from Sacramento as I could afford to go, choosing schools that offered generous financial aid packages and would allow me to build a life separate from my family's dysfunction. My parents barely registered my college application process, too busy celebrating Victoria's graduation from Stanford and managing Derek's increasingly demanding schedule of activities. When I received my acceptance letters, including admission to several excellent schools with substantial scholarship packages, I shared the news at dinner one evening. My mother glanced up from her plate and said that was nice before returning her attention to Derek's latest story about his basketball team. My father asked which school was cheapest since they could not afford to contribute anything toward my education. Victoria, home for a visit, offered congratulations that felt genuine but also somehow highlighted how differently my accomplishments were received compared to hers. I realized in that moment that leaving home was not going to be the emotional liberation I had imagined, but rather a continuation of the isolation I had experienced my entire life. The summer before I left for college, I worked full-time to save money for expenses my scholarships would not cover. My parents treated my impending departure with an odd mixture of relief and indifference, as though I were a temporary houseguest whose lease was finally up rather than their daughter beginning an important new chapter of life. They did not help me pack, did not offer advice about living independently, did not seem to feel any particular emotion about my leaving beyond a general sense that one obligation was being lifted from their shoulders. When the day came for me to drive to my university several hours away, I loaded my few possessions into my unreliable car by myself while my parents slept in on their Saturday morning. I had hoped they might wake early to see me off, might offer some moment of parental blessing or acknowledgement that something significant was happening. Instead, I left a note on the kitchen counter thanking them for everything and drove away from the house where I had grown up feeling like a burden, heading toward a future where perhaps I could finally learn to be something else. But family patterns are not so easily escaped. The beliefs we develop about ourselves in childhood become the lens through which we interpret all subsequent experiences. I carried the burden label with me to college, to my first jobs, to my early attempts at romantic relationships. I expected to be too much, anticipated being a disappointment, prepared myself for the inevitable moment when people would recognize that I was not worth the effort I required. This expectation became self-fulfilling in ways I did not understand until years of therapy helped me see the patterns clearly. And through all of it, my parents continued their involvement with Victoria and Derek, celebrating her career achievements and funding his various entrepreneurial dreams, while maintaining a polite but distant relationship with me. I called home regularly in those early years away, still hoping that distance might somehow make them appreciate me more. The conversations were always brief and superficial, my mother updating me on Victoria and Derek's lives while showing minimal interest in mine, my father contributing little beyond occasional grunts of acknowledgement. The distance I had hoped would create fondness instead simply made explicit what had always been true. They did not miss me when I was gone because they had never particularly enjoyed my presence when I was there. I was the obligation they had fulfilled by raising me to legal adulthood, the burden they had successfully carried until I could carry myself. And now that I was out of their house and financially independent, they felt no particular need to maintain more than the most minimal connection required by social expectations of family relationships. Understanding the origins of our dysfunction did not make it hurt less, but it did help me recognize that the problem had never been me. I was not inherently burdensome or unlovable or disappointing. I had simply had the profound misfortune of being born to parents who lacked the emotional capacity to love a child who did not fit their narrow expectations, who did not arrive at the right time or display the right characteristics or fulfill their specific hopes for what a daughter should be. This recognition, hard-won through years of therapy and self-reflection, was what had given me the strength to finally draw the line yesterday in the bank. I could see our family dynamics clearly now, could understand exactly how I had been positioned as the problem child to justify my parents' failure to provide adequate emotional support. And I could finally, after 33 years, refuse to accept their characterization of me as accurate or fair. The coffee had gone cold in my cup while I sat lost in these memories, the morning sun now fully illuminating my small bedroom. I stood and stretched, feeling the physical tension that always accompanied deep reflection on my childhood. The past could not be changed, but my response to it could evolve. I had spent too many years trying to prove I was not a burden by being the most self-sufficient person possible, by asking for nothing and offering everything, by demonstrating my worth through tireless service that was never acknowledged or appreciated. Yesterday, I had finally stopped trying to prove anything. I had simply stated the truth and walked away, leaving them to sit with the uncomfortable reality of what they had done and who they had been as parents. The girl who had loaded her car alone on that long-ago Saturday morning would have been proud of the woman I had become, I thought. She had survived everything they put her through and built something beautiful anyway. And that was more than enough. I finally turned on my phone around mid-morning, after I had finished my coffee and taken a long shower that felt more like a cleansing ritual than simple hygiene. The The screen lit up with a cascade of notifications that I had been expecting, but was still unprepared to face in their full intensity. 47 text messages, 19 missed calls, and 6 voicemails, all from various combinations of my parents and my sister Victoria. My brother Derek, true to form, had not attempted to contact me at all, either because he remained blissfully unaware of the situation or because he understood instinctively that this particular family crisis did not require his involvement. I made myself a second cup of coffee and settled into my favorite chair before beginning to review the messages, needing the comfort of my carefully created sanctuary, as I waded into the emotional manipulation I knew awaited me. The early messages from my mother, sent within minutes of my departure from the bank yesterday, were predictably frantic and accusatory. How could I embarrass them like that in public? How could I be so cruel and heartless? Did I have any idea what I had done to them? Each message escalated in emotional intensity, building toward a crescendo of wounded outrage that would have been more effective if I had not seen this exact pattern deployed dozens of times throughout my life. My father's messages were fewer, but carried their own particular flavor of disappointment and bewilderment. He wrote that he could not understand why I was being so unreasonable, that families were supposed to help each other, that he had never imagined his own daughter could be so vindictive and cold. The language was calculated to trigger my guilt response, to position me as the aggressor in a situation where I was simply refusing to continue being victimized. I recognized the manipulation for what it was, but recognition did not completely eliminate the uncomfortable twinge of doubt his words created. Victoria's messages began appearing around 8 o'clock the previous evening, after my parents had clearly contacted her to recruit her assistance in bringing me back into line. Her approach was different from our parents', more measured and seemingly reasonable, which made it potentially more effective and therefore more dangerous to my hard-won clarity. She wrote that she understood I was upset, that family dynamics were complicated, that perhaps we could all sit down together and talk through whatever misunderstanding had occurred. The framing of 7 years of secretly paid mortgage as a misunderstanding was almost admirably audacious in its disconnect from reality. As I scrolled through the messages, I began to notice patterns that would have been less obvious if I had been reading them in real time under emotional duress. My mother's messages fluctuated between rage and victimhood, never landing on genuine remorse or accountability. My father's communications positioned him as a confused bystander, rather than an active participant in decades of emotional neglect. Victoria's careful neutrality allowed her to appear reasonable while ultimately siding with our parents and pressuring me to back down from the boundaries I had established. The coordination was not explicit, but the combined effect was clearly designed to overwhelm my defenses and force me to capitulate to their demands. What struck me most forcefully as I reviewed these messages was the complete absence of any acknowledgement of the actual issue at hand. Not one message addressed the fact that I had been paying their mortgage for 7 years while being called a burden. Not one expressed gratitude for the financial support I had provided. Not one offered an apology for the cruelty of my mother's comment in the bank, or for the decades of treatment that comment represented. Instead, every message focused exclusively on my supposed overreaction, my inappropriate behavior, my failure to understand family obligations and respond with appropriate gratitude for everything they had supposedly done for me. This selective attention to only the parts of reality that supported their narrative was not new, but seeing it laid out so explicitly in written form made the pattern impossible to ignore or rationalize away. They were not interested in truth or reconciliation or genuine relationship repair. They were interested in reestablishing the previous dynamic where I provided financial and emotional support, while accepting their characterization of me as burdensome and ungrateful. Any outcome that did not restore that comfortable arrangement was unacceptable to them, regardless of how unfair or damaging it had been to me. I set my phone down and stared out the window at the clear morning sky, feeling the complicated mixture of emotions that came with truly seeing my family dynamics with unclouded eyes. There was grief for the family I had never had and would never have, anger at the years I had wasted trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it, and beneath both of those feelings, something that felt surprisingly like relief. The performance was over. I no longer had to pretend that their treatment of me was acceptable, or that my hurt was unjustified, or that I was somehow the problem in our dysfunctional equation. The specific patterns of favoritism that had characterized my childhood came into sharp focus as I considered how to respond to these messages, or whether to respond at all. Victoria had always been the easy child, the one whose natural gifts aligned perfectly with what my parents valued and understood. She was conventionally beautiful in a way that opened doors and generated compliments that my parents accepted as reflections of their own superior genetics. Her thick auburn hair fell in natural waves that required minimal styling, while my straight brown hair hung limp and lifeless no matter what products I tried. Her delicate features and petite frame fit cultural ideals of feminine beauty, while my height and angular bone structure made me feel perpetually awkward and unfeminine throughout my adolescence. But the physical differences, while noticeable, were less significant than the temperamental contrast that made Victoria so much easier for my parents to love and celebrate. She was naturally social and charming, able to navigate complex social situations with an ease I never managed to develop. She made friends effortlessly, drawing people to her with warmth and charisma that seemed innate rather than learned. My parents basked in the reflected glow of her popularity, attending her various social events and meeting the parents of her impressive friend group, positioning themselves as the proud creators of this socially successful young woman. I, by contrast, was introverted and serious, more comfortable with books than people, more interested in ideas than social dynamics. I had a small circle of close friends rather than Victoria's large network of acquaintances, and I preferred deep one-on-one conversations to the group activities and parties that Victoria navigated so skillfully. My parents interpreted my introversion as social deficiency rather than natural temperament, frequently expressing concern that I was not more like my sister in this regard. They pushed me toward activities and social situations that left me exhausted and anxious, unable to understand that different personality types require different approaches to social connection and fulfillment. Victoria's academic success came easily and visibly, with report cards full of perfect grades that required little apparent effort on her part. She absorbed information quickly, tested well, and seemed to intuitively grasp whatever material her teachers presented. My parents proudly displayed her academic achievements, framing them for prominent placement on walls and refrigerator doors, calling relatives to share news of her latest perfect test score or academic award. The ease of her success made it seem almost inevitable, as though she had been destined from birth to excel in traditional academic settings. My own academic experience was far more complicated and far less celebrated. I was intelligent, my teachers assured me, but my mind worked in ways that did not align well with standardized curricula and testing formats. I needed to understand the deeper principles behind concepts, rather than simply memorizing procedures and formulas. I made connections between disparate ideas that seemed obvious to me but confused my teachers who were following linear lesson plans. I could solve complex problems through unconventional methods, but struggled to show my work in the expected format, resulting in partial credit or outright marking wrong despite arriving at correct answers. My report cards reflected this mismatch between my actual intelligence and my performance in traditional academic settings. I earned a mixture of grades that averaged out to slightly above average overall, but the inconsistency troubled my parents far more than if I had been consistently mediocre. They could not understand how I could excel in some areas while struggling in others, viewing the inconsistency as evidence of insufficient effort, rather than as a learning profile that required different approaches and support. When I brought home a report card with 3 A grades and 2 C grades, my parents focused exclusively on the C grades, asking what I had done wrong and what I needed to fix, never acknowledging the subjects where I had excelled. The contrast in how they responded to Victoria's achievements versus my own was stark enough that even my young self could not help but notice and internalize the disparity. When Victoria made the honor roll, which she did consistently throughout her academic career, my parents took her out to her favorite restaurant to celebrate and called both sets of grandparents to share the good news. When I made the honor roll, which happened occasionally when my stronger subjects outweighed my weaker ones, my mother would glance at the report card and say that was nice before returning her attention to whatever else she had been doing. There was no celebration, no special acknowledgement, no sense that this achievement was worthy of the same recognition Victoria's identical accomplishment had received. The differential treatment extended to every aspect of our childhoods in ways that were sometimes subtle and sometimes painfully obvious. When Victoria expressed interest in ballet at age 6, my parents immediately enrolled her in classes at the most prestigious dance studio in our area, purchasing expensive leotards and shoes and attending every recital with cameras and flowers. She studied ballet for 8 years, progressing through levels and performing in annual productions that my parents invited extended family to attend. The financial investment was substantial, but it was framed as worthwhile because Victoria had talent and dedication that deserved support and development. When I expressed interest in art classes at age 8, asking if I could attend a summer program at the community center that cost a fraction of what Victoria's dance classes required, my mother explained that we could not afford extras like that right now. Money was tight, she said, and art was not a practical skill that would help my future the way Victoria's dance training was building her discipline and grace. The rejection stung not just because I was denied something I wanted but because the reasoning made so little sense. Art classes were too expensive, but ballet lessons were an investment. My interests were impractical hobbies, while Victoria's were valuable skills worth cultivating. I learned through these repeated experiences that my desires and interests were fundamentally less important than Victoria's, that my parents' limited resources of money and attention would always be allocated to her first and to me only if anything remained after her needs and wants were satisfied. This understanding shaped how I approached every subsequent request or expression of need. I learned to preemptively minimize my desires, to convince myself I did not really want things before asking became necessary, to accept that disappointment was inevitable, and that hoping for different treatment would only make that disappointment more painful. The physical manifestations of favoritism were perhaps the most visible, and therefore the hardest to rationalize away or pretend I was misinterpreting. Victoria's bedroom was redecorated when she turned 10, transformed from a simple child's room into a carefully designed space that reflected her evolving tastes and interests. My parents hired a decorator who helped select coordinating furniture, custom window treatments, and a sophisticated color palette that made the room look like something from a magazine spread. Victoria was consulted about every decision, her preferences driving the choices about how her personal space would look and function. My bedroom remained essentially unchanged from early childhood through my departure for college, furnished with hand-me-down pieces and painted a neutral beige that my mother had selected when I was a toddler. When I asked at age 12 if my room could be repainted, suggesting that I might like a different color now that I was older, my mother said that paint was expensive and the current color was perfectly fine. When I offered to paint it myself if she would just buy the paint, she said she did not trust me not to make a mess and that I should be grateful to have my own room at all rather than complaining about its color. The Christmas when Victoria turned 13, and I was 16 illustrated the pattern with painful clarity. Victoria received a new laptop computer, expensive professional quality art supplies for a drawing hobby she had recently developed, several designer clothing items she had specifically requested, and an elaborate jewelry box filled with age-appropriate jewelry. The gifts were thoughtfully selected and generously given, presented with genuine excitement about Victoria's reaction and pleasure in providing her with things that would bring her joy. My gifts that same Christmas consisted of practical items I needed rather than wanted, things like socks and underwear and school supplies, along with a single book I had mentioned wanting months earlier. The disparity was so obvious that even Victoria looked uncomfortable as we opened presents, though she said nothing that might disrupt the morning or challenge our parents' choices. I thanked them for my gifts with as much enthusiasm as I could manufacture, then excused myself to my room where I cried quietly into my pillow, trying to understand what I had done to deserve such obvious differential treatment. When I mentioned the disparity to my mother later, asking as gently as I could why Victoria's gifts had been so much more substantial than mine, she became immediately defensive and angry. Victoria was younger and still needed more things, she said. I was nearly an adult and should be thinking about practical necessities rather than wanting frivolous gifts. Besides, she added with an edge to her voice, I had never been as appreciative of gifts as Victoria was, always finding something to complain about rather than being grateful for what I received. The accusation was so disconnected from reality that I could not even formulate a response. I had never complained about gifts, had in fact trained myself to express gratitude for even the most disappointing presents because I had learned early that any hint of disappointment would be used as evidence of my fundamentally ungrateful nature. Derek's arrival when I was 9 added another dimension to the favoritism that had already defined my childhood. As the long-awaited son after 2 daughters, he was treated as precious and special from his first breath. My parents' excitement about having a boy was palpable and frequently articulated, their comments about finally having a son suggesting that Victoria and I had been somehow incomplete or insufficient as daughters. They began referring to Derek as their miracle baby, Though there was nothing medically miraculous about his conception or birth, the miracle, it seemed, was simply that he was male. The indulgence Derek received from infancy onward was extraordinary even compared to how Victoria had been treated. Where she had been praised for actual achievements, Derek was praised simply for existing. Where she had been given advantages and opportunities, Derek was given those same advantages plus unlimited patience for his mistakes and misbehavior. Rules that had governed Victoria's and my childhoods were relaxed or eliminated entirely for Derek, with my parents explaining that boys were different and needed more freedom and flexibility than girls required. When Derek threw tantrums in stores because he was denied a toy he wanted, my parents would eventually give in rather than endure the public scene, rewarding his manipulation and teaching him that persistence and emotional escalation would get him what he desired. When Victoria or I had attempted similar behavior as young children, we had been immediately removed from the store and disciplined for our unacceptable conduct. The different standards were so obvious that even young Derek seemed aware of his privileged position, wielding his status as the baby and the only boy to get away with behavior that would never have been tolerated from his sisters. As Derek grew from toddler to child to adolescent, the pattern of indulgence only intensified. He was allowed to quit activities that became difficult or boring, while Victoria and I had been forced to complete seasons and semesters of commitments we made. He was given expensive gaming systems and technology that my parents had claimed we could not afford when I had requested far less costly items. He was excused from household chores that had been my and Victoria's responsibilities at the same age, with my parents explaining that he needed to focus on school and his various activities rather than wasting time on cleaning. The message to me was devastatingly clear through all of these contrasts and comparisons. Victoria was valuable because she was beautiful and accomplished and socially successful, everything a daughter should ideally be. Derek was valuable because he was male and charming and full of potential that would surely manifest once he found the right outlet for his talents. And I was the mistake between them, the difficult practice child who had arrived at the wrong time and never managed to develop the characteristics that would make me worth celebrating or investing in or treating with the same care and attention my siblings received as a matter of course. I learned to watch my siblings receive what I was denied, and to internalize the lesson that I simply mattered less than they did in our parents' hierarchy of importance. I learned to expect nothing, and to be grateful for scraps of attention or affection that came my way. I learned that asking for equal treatment would be met with defensiveness and accusations that I was being jealous or difficult, or failing to appreciate everything my parents had supposedly done for me. And most damagingly, I learned that the problem was fundamentally me, that if I were just different in some essential way, perhaps I too would be worth the kind of love and celebration my parents so freely gave to Victoria and Derek. These patterns established in childhood had continued into adulthood with remarkable consistency. Victoria was still the golden child whose career achievements and family milestones were celebrated and shared with everyone my parents knew. Derek was still the promising son whose various failed ventures were reframed as learning experiences on his path to inevitable success. And I was still the burden, the one who was expected to help when needed but who should not expect reciprocal support or acknowledgement for what I provided. The realization that nothing had fundamentally changed despite all my efforts to prove my worth was both liberating and heartbreaking. I had spent 33 years trying to earn through achievement what Victoria had been given freely through birth order and temperament, what Derek had been granted automatically through gender and charm. I had been fighting an unwinnable battle, trying to prove I deserved love to people who had decided before I could walk or talk that I would never quite measure up to their standards or fulfill their vision of what a daughter should be. But I was done fighting now. The confrontation at the bank had finally broken through my denial and forced me to see our family dynamics with brutal clarity. They would never celebrate me the way they celebrated Victoria. They would never invest in me the way they invested in Derek. They would never stop seeing me as a burden regardless of how much I gave or how little I asked for in return. And I could finally, after all these years, stop trying to change their perception and focus instead on building a life that did not require their validation to feel meaningful and worthwhile. I picked up my phone and began composing responses to the flood of messages, not because I owed them explanations but because I needed to articulate my boundaries clearly for my own sake. The old Maya would have written long justifications, trying to make them understand why their treatment had been hurtful and unfair. The new Maya, the one who had walked out of that bank with her head held high, understood that they would never truly hear or accept anything that challenged their carefully constructed narrative about our family. So I kept my responses brief and factual, refusing to engage with the emotional manipulation or defend decisions I had every right to make. To my mother, I wrote simply that my boundary would remain firm, and that further attempts to guilt or pressure me would result in extended periods of no contact. To my father, I stated that I would not be discussing this decision further, and that they needed to make alternative arrangements for their mortgage. To Victoria, I acknowledged her attempt at mediation but explained that this was not a misunderstanding to be talked through, but rather a necessary boundary to protect my own well-being after decades of unequal and unfair treatment. I sent the messages before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone again and set it aside. The beautiful Portland morning was slipping toward afternoon, and I had already spent too much emotional energy on people who had never valued what I offered them. I stood and stretched, looking around my carefully created home with fresh appreciation for everything it represented. This was my life now, built from my own efforts and my own choices, and it was time to stop letting my family's dysfunction cast shadows over the bright space I had worked so hard to create. The burden they had always accused me of being was theirs to carry now, not mine, and I was finally truly free. The following days passed in a strange suspension of time, where hours felt simultaneously rushed and endless. I maintained my routine with deliberate intention, going to work each morning and focusing on projects that required my full analytical attention, grateful for the distraction that complex financial modeling provided from the emotional turmoil that waited for me outside office hours. My colleagues noticed nothing different about my demeanor, which I took as evidence that I had successfully developed the professional compartmentalization skills that allowed me to function at high levels regardless of personal circumstances. This ability to separate my inner emotional landscape from my outer professional performance had been hard-won through years of practice, cultivated initially as a survival mechanism during my difficult childhood, and refined throughout my career as an essential workplace competency. My supervisor, Rachel Chun, a woman in her late 40s who had built an impressive career in sustainable finance through a combination of technical expertise and emotional intelligence, stopped by my desk on Thursday afternoon with a question about the renewable energy portfolio analysis I had been developing. We discussed the modeling assumptions and risk factors for nearly 30 minutes, my mind finding welcome relief in the clean logic of financial projections and probability distributions. As our conversation concluded, Rachel paused and looked at me with the slightly concerned expression of someone who sensed something beneath the surface but was uncertain whether to probe deeper. "You seem like you have a lot on your mind lately," she observed carefully, her tone making it clear that this was an opening for me to share if I chose but not a demand for explanation if I preferred to keep my personal life separate from work. "I just want you to know that if you need any flexibility with your schedule or workload right now, we can certainly accommodate that. You have more than earned the trust and autonomy to manage your time as you see fit." The kindness in her offer touched something tender in me, and I felt unexpected tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I blinked them back quickly, maintaining my professional composure while acknowledging the genuine care behind her words. "Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate that more than you know. I am dealing with some complicated family situations, but I am managing them. Work is actually a welcome constant right now, something I can control and understand when other areas of my life feel chaotic." Rachel nodded with the understanding of someone who had likely navigated her own share of personal challenges while maintaining professional excellence. Family situations can be some of the most difficult to process because they involve such deep emotional history and patterns. Just remember that taking care of yourself is not selfish. It is essential. You cannot pour from an empty cup, as the saying goes. And you are far too valuable to this organization and to yourself to run yourself into the ground trying to manage everything perfectly. Her words stayed with me as I returned to my analysis, and I found myself thinking about the concept of pouring from an empty cup in relation to my family dynamics. I had been pouring for my parents for 7 years, funding their mortgage while receiving nothing in return except continued characterization as a burden. I had been emptying myself financially and emotionally to fill their needs while my own cup remained perpetually drained. The metaphor was so apt it was almost painful in its clarity. That evening I received a certified letter at my apartment, the kind of official correspondence that immediately signals something significant and potentially unpleasant. I signed for it with the delivery person and carried the envelope inside with a sense of foreboding that proved entirely justified when I opened it and read the contents. My parents had retained an attorney who had written a formal legal letter suggesting that my cessation of mortgage payments constituted a breach of an implied family contract, and that I could potentially be held liable for any damages they suffered as a result of my withdrawal of financial support. The letter was clearly designed to intimidate me into resuming payments, leveraging legal language and vague threats to trigger my anxiety and compliance. I read it twice, feeling my initial spike of fear gradually transform into cold anger, as I recognized the manipulation tactic for what it was. They were not actually threatening to sue me, a fact that became clear upon careful reading of the carefully worded document. They were simply trying to scare me into believing that I had legal obligations I did not actually have, hoping that my lack of legal knowledge would work in their favor. I photographed the letter with my phone and immediately sent it to a friend from college who had become a family law attorney, asking for her professional assessment of whether I had any actual legal exposure. Her response came within an hour, and it was exactly what I had suspected once my initial emotional reaction had subsided. There was no such thing as an implied family contract of the type my parents' attorney was suggesting, and I had absolutely no legal obligation to continue providing financial support to my able-bodied parents who were capable of earning their own income and managing their own expenses. The letter was pure intimidation with no legal foundation whatsoever. "This is actually pretty disgusting behavior from their attorney," my friend wrote in her text message accompanying her professional assessment. "Using legal letterhead to threaten someone into providing financial support they have no obligation to give is ethically questionable at best. You have every right to stop making payments on a mortgage for a house you do not own and have never lived in as an adult. If they actually tried to take you to court over this, which I doubt they would because any judge would throw it out immediately, you would likely be able to file a complaint against their attorney for abuse of legal process. Save that letter as documentation of their harassment, but otherwise ignore it completely." The validation from someone with actual legal expertise was enormously helpful in countering the anxiety the letter had been designed to provoke. I filed it away in a folder I was creating to document all interactions related to this situation, having learned from my professional experience that thorough documentation was always valuable when dealing with potential conflicts. Then I poured myself a glass of wine and sat down to think carefully about the timeline that had led to this moment, the specific events and decisions that had brought us all to this point of rupture and confrontation. The initial request for financial help had come 3 weeks earlier, on that Saturday morning when my mother's panicked call had interrupted my peaceful weekend plans. I had been planning to spend the day hiking one of the trails in Forest Park, taking advantage of a rare clear Saturday to immerse myself in the natural beauty that was one of Portland's greatest assets. Instead, I had spent hours on the phone and researching options, trying to figure out how to help my parents without completely derailing my own financial planning and future security. The conversation with my mother that day had followed such a familiar script that I could have predicted nearly every element before it unfolded. The initial panic and urgency designed to make me feel that immediate action was required without time for careful consideration. The subtle and not-so-subtle implications that a good daughter would not hesitate to help her parents in their time of need. The carefully deployed guilt about how much they had supposedly sacrificed for me over the years, sacrifices that apparently justified unlimited ongoing financial support, regardless of their own poor financial management or my own needs and goals. What I had not anticipated during that initial conversation was my mother's mention that they were 6 months behind on their mortgage payments. 6 months represented a substantial amount of missed payments, far beyond what could be explained by a single unexpected expense or temporary cash flow problem. It suggested a pattern of financial mismanagement and avoidance that had been building for quite some time before they finally acknowledged the problem had reached crisis proportions. The question that had immediately formed in my mind was what they had been doing with the money that should have been going toward their mortgage during those 6 months. I had asked this question as delicately as I could manage, framing it as necessary information to understand their overall financial situation and determine what kind of help might be most effective. My mother's response had been defensive and vague, offering explanations about unexpected expenses and reduced income that did not quite add up to the shortfall they were claiming. She mentioned that my father's hours at his job had been reduced, though when I asked by how much, she could not provide specific numbers. She referenced medical expenses that insurance had not fully covered, though she could not recall the actual amounts when pressed for details. The vagueness had raised red flags that I tried to suppress, not wanting to be the suspicious daughter who doubted her parents' word about their financial struggles. But my professional training in financial analysis had made me attuned to inconsistencies and gaps in financial narratives, and my parents' story had contained numerous such gaps. I had set aside my concerns at the time, telling myself that they were stressed and perhaps simply did not have precise numbers readily available, that I should give them the benefit of the doubt rather than approaching the situation with skepticism. In retrospect, I should have trusted my professional instincts and pushed harder for complete financial transparency before agreeing to take on their mortgage payments. I should have insisted on reviewing their complete budget and bank statements to understand exactly where their money was going and why they were unable to meet their basic housing obligation. I should have recognized the warning signs that suggested this was not actually a temporary crisis, but rather a chronic pattern of financial dysfunction that would continue regardless of what support I provided. But I had wanted to believe that this time would be different, that this crisis would be the catalyst that finally made them recognize my value and appreciate my contribution to their well-being. Some part of me, the wounded child who still lived deep inside despite all my adult accomplishments and hard-won wisdom, had hoped that saving their house would finally earn me the love and recognition I had been seeking my entire life. I had been willing to overlook the red flags and suspend my professional skepticism, because I desperately wanted to believe that this grand gesture would transform our relationship in ways that 3 decades of smaller efforts had failed to achieve. The decision to take over their mortgage payments entirely rather than simply providing a one-time bailout had been mine, made after several days of careful consideration and consultation with my financial advisor. The logic had seemed sound at the time. A lump sum payment would only delay the inevitable next crisis, whereas ongoing monthly payments would provide stable housing security and allow them to use their income for other essential expenses. I had structured it as a gift rather than a loan, not wanting the complications of repayment expectations or the emotional dynamics that would come with them owing me money in any official capacity. I had contacted their bank directly and arranged everything through the mortgage department, setting up automatic monthly transfers from my checking account to their loan account. The bank had been enormously relieved to have the delinquent account brought current and to establish a reliable payment source going forward. I had requested that the bank not disclose to my parents exactly who was making the payments or through what mechanism, wanting to maintain some privacy around my financial arrangements. The bank representative I worked with, a different person than Jennifer Chun who would later witness the confrontation, had assured me that they would simply note that payments were being received and that the account was in good standing. My parents had never asked for details about how I had structured the payment arrangement or expressed any curiosity about the logistics of my financial support. They had accepted my offer with what I now recognized as suspiciously little gratitude or acknowledgement, treating my commitment to pay their mortgage indefinitely as though it were a minor favor rather than a substantial ongoing financial sacrifice. At the time, I had interpreted their lack of effusive thanks as simply their usual emotional restraint, their lifelong discomfort with expressing feelings or acknowledging vulnerability. Now I understood that their muted response had been less about emotional restraint and more about their fundamental belief that I owed them this support, that my willingness to take on their mortgage was simply the discharge of a daughter's natural obligation to parents who had raised her. In their worldview, I was not doing them a favor by paying their mortgage for 7 years. I was finally contributing my fair share after years of being a burden on their resources, evening out some cosmic ledger they had been maintaining in their minds since my birth. The 7 years of payments had passed with remarkable consistency and lack of drama. On the first of every month, the automatic transfer would process, moving $1,400 from my checking account to their mortgage account without requiring any action or attention from me beyond ensuring sufficient funds were available. The automation had been intentional, a way to make the support as frictionless as possible, and to avoid the emotional labor of manually processing each payment and confronting each month what I was giving to people who had never given me comparable support. During those 7 years, my life had continued to evolve and grow in ways my parents never witnessed or acknowledged, because they never asked about my experiences in any meaningful depth. I had been promoted twice at work, moving from a mid-level analyst position to a senior analyst role with increasing responsibility and visibility within the organization. I had navigated a serious romantic relationship that ultimately ended when my partner accepted a job opportunity across the country, and we realized our visions for the future were not compatible enough to sustain a long-distance relationship followed by major life reorganization. I had dealt with a health scare when unusual test results required months of follow-up appointments and additional testing before doctors finally determined that the abnormality was benign and required no treatment beyond regular monitoring. The anxiety and medical expenses during that period had been substantial, draining my emergency fund and forcing me to cut back on other expenses to maintain my mortgage payment to my parents while managing my own healthcare costs. I had not told them about any of this, knowing from long experience that they would either minimize my concerns or find some way to make my health crisis about them and their anxiety rather than offering me the support and comfort I actually needed. I had changed apartments twice during those 7 years, each move representing an upgrade in my living situation as my income increased and my ability to afford nicer spaces improved. I had taken on a significant professional development project, earning a specialized certification in sustainable investment analysis that had required 18 months of evening and weekend study, while maintaining my full-time work responsibilities. I had traveled internationally for the first time, taking a 2-week trip to Costa Rica that had expanded my worldview and given me perspective on how much beauty and adventure existed beyond the narrow confines of my family dysfunction. Through all of these experiences, both challenging and joyful, my parents had remained peripheral figures who occupied minimal space in my actual daily life, while consuming substantial mental and emotional energy through their continued judgment and criticism of choices they knew nothing about. They had not visited my apartments or celebrated my promotions or supported me through health scares, or expressed any genuine interest in my travels or professional development. Our communication had remained limited to brief phone calls every few months where they updated me on Victoria's accomplishments and Derek's latest ventures, while asking me perfunctory questions about my life that they clearly had no real interest in hearing answered in any depth. The mortgage payments had continued through everything, a constant background obligation that I had learned to simply accept as part of my monthly budget, the same way I accepted utility bills or insurance premiums. The amount was significant enough that it impacted my other financial goals and limited my flexibility, but I had adjusted my lifestyle and spending patterns to accommodate it. I had delayed purchasing my own property because I could not save for a down payment while making their mortgage payment. I had driven my aging car years longer than I should have because I could not afford both a car payment and their mortgage payment. I had declined invitations to destination weddings and other travel opportunities because my discretionary budget was too constrained after accounting for their housing costs. These sacrifices had been real and substantial, affecting my quality of life and limiting my options in ways that would have been invisible to any outside observer who saw only my professional success and my comfortable-appearing lifestyle. I had made do with less than I could have otherwise afforded specifically because I was supporting my parents financially while they told everyone who would listen that I was the selfish daughter who never helped her family or showed appropriate gratitude for everything they had done for me. The breaking point had come not with the mortgage payments themselves, which I had apparently been willing to continue indefinitely despite the cost and lack of appreciation, but with their attempt to expand my financial obligation without my knowledge or consent. The refinancing scheme they had presented as a simple paperwork formality had been, upon closer examination of the documents, an attempt to extract additional money from the house while making me legally responsible for the increased debt. They had been planning to borrow $150,000 against the equity in their home, equity that existed primarily because I had been making their mortgage payments faithfully for 7 years, and they expected me to simply agree to this expansion of my obligation without question or negotiation. The destination of that borrowed money had been particularly galling in its demonstration of their priorities and values. $50,000 for Derek's latest business venture, described to me in the vaguest possible terms that suggested even my parents did not fully understand what he was proposing to do with the money. $75,000 for Victoria to purchase a vacation cabin in Lake Tahoe that would supposedly be available for all family use, though I had not been consulted about this purchase or asked whether I had any interest in such a property. And $25,000 for various home improvements and updates that my parents claimed were necessary, but which seemed to align more with wants than needs based on the descriptions they provided. Not $1 of that $150,000 was intended for anything that would benefit me or address any of my needs or goals. The money was being extracted from a house I had been paying for, backed by equity I had helped preserve through my payments, to fund projects and purchases for my siblings who had never contributed anything to my parents' housing costs or offered any support during the years they were struggling financially. And I was expected to not only allow this extraction, but to take on legal responsibility for the expanded debt, increasing my monthly obligation to support a family that had never supported me in any comparable way. The audacity of the scheme was almost impressive in its scope and assumptions. They had been so confident that I would comply, so certain that the patterns established over 3 decades would hold firm, that they had not even considered the possibility I might refuse or question the arrangement. They had simply assumed that I would sign whatever documents they put in front of me, that I would accept whatever expansion of my obligations they proposed, that I would continue enabling their dysfunction and subsidizing their choices no matter how unfair or one-sided the arrangement became. That confidence had been their critical miscalculation. Something in me had finally reached its breaking point, some internal threshold of tolerance that I had not even known existed until I crossed it. Reading those refinancing documents and understanding what they were actually proposing to do had cracked something open inside me, had allowed me to see our entire relationship with a clarity I had been avoiding for years because that clarity was too painful to sustain, while still maintaining the fiction that we were a functional family who loved and supported each other. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.